Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Wheeler Centre event at Deakin Edge. I'm Ramona Koval, and tonight I'm continuing a conversation that Etgar Keret and I began about 12 years ago. Was it in Melbourne? Was it in Perth? Was it in Brisbane? At a writers' festival, and has continued off and on since then. I'm sure that most of us here are Etgar Keret fans and know everything about him, but for the 3 or 4 who might be new to the pleasure of his work, he was born in Ramat Gan in Israel in 1967. He is the youngest of 3 children born to his parents who were Holocaust survivors from Poland. He lives in Tel Aviv with his very brilliant wife Shira Geffen and their son Lev. His name means urban challenge because despite the odds he survived his birth. Etgar's previous book was a collection of short stories called Suddenly a Knock on the Door. His voice in them is singular. No one writes like he does and about the things that he does. He's an absurdist with a perfect ear for the way people think to themselves and talk, even in translation. But this latest book is a departure because The 7 Good Years is a non-fiction collection of vignettes over the first 7 years of his son Lev's life, from his birth to the death 7 years later of Etgar's own father. As one critic put it, this collection of unusual coincidences and tiny vignettes of a life lived on the constant, bittersweet edge of surrealism, this scattering of laughs, this pack of sighs. Please welcome Etgar to Melbourne again. I like that phrase a lot, this pack of sighs. And we're very lucky because Etgar's going to read for us first. Would you like to introduce this?
Yes, I'm going to read the first chapter in the book, which is basically about the birth of our son. And if it's okay, I'll stand. Not that it makes much difference with my height, but yeah, it's like sitting and reading in English, it's too much. So. Suddenly the same thing. I just hate terrorist attacks, the thin nurse says to the older one. Want some gum? The older nurse takes a piece and nods. What can you do, she says. I also hate emergencies. It's not the emergencies, the thin one insists. I have no problem with accidents and things. It's the terrorist attacks. I'm telling you, they put a damper on everything. Sitting on the bench outside the maternity ward, I think to myself, she's got a point. I got here just an hour ago, all excited with my wife and a neat freak taxi driver who, when my wife's water broke, was afraid it would ruin his upholstery. And now I'm sitting in the hallway, feeling gloom, waiting for the staff to come back from the ER. Everyone but the 2 nurses has gone to help treat the people injured in the attack. My wife's contractions have slowed down too. Probably even the baby feels this whole getting born thing isn't that urgent anymore. As I'm on my way to the cafeteria, a few of the injured roll past on squeaking gurneys. In the taxi on the way to the hospital, my wife was screaming like a mad woman, but all these people are quiet. Are you Etgar Keret? A guy wearing a checked shirt asks me. The writer? I nod reluctantly. Well, what do you know, he says, pulling a tiny tape recorder out of his bag. Where were you when it happened, he asks. When I hesitate for a second, he says in a show of empathy, take your time, don't feel pressured. You've been through a trauma. I wasn't in the attack, I explain. I just happened to be here today. My wife's giving birth. Oh, he says, not trying to hide his disappointment, and presses the stop button on his tape recorder. Mazel tov. Now he sits down next to me and lights himself a cigarette. Maybe you should try talking to someone else, I suggest, as an attempt to get the Lucky Strike smoke out of my face. A minute ago, I saw them take 2 people into neurology. Russians, he says with a sigh, don't know a word in Hebrew. Besides, they don't let you into neurology anyway. This is my 7th attack in this hospital, and I know all the shtick by now. We sit there a minute without talking. He's about 10 years younger than I am, but starting to go bald. When he catches me looking at him, he smiles and says, Too bad you weren't there. A reaction from a writer would have been good for my article. Someone original, someone with a little vision. After every attack, I always get the same reactions. Suddenly I heard a boom. I don't know what happened. Everything was covered in blood. How much of that can you take? It's not their fault, I say. It's just that the attacks are always the same. What kind of original thing can you say about an explosion and senseless death? Beats me, he says with a shrug. You're the writer. Some people in white jackets are starting to come back from the ER on the way to the maternity ward. You're from Tel Aviv, the reporter says to me. So why did you come all the way to this dump to give birth? We wanted a natural birth, the department here. Natural? He interrupts, sniggering. What's natural about a midget with a cable hanging from his belly button popping out of your wife's vagina? I don't even try to respond. I told my wife, he continues, if you ever give birth, only by cesarean section, like in America. I don't want some baby stretching you out of shape from me. Nowadays, it's only in primitive countries like this that women give birth like animals. Yalla, I'm going to work. Starting to get up, he tries one more time. Maybe you have something to say about the attack anyway, he asks. Did it change anything for you, like what you're going to name the baby or something? I don't know. I smile apologetically. Never mind, he says with a wink. I hope it goes easy, man. 6 hours later, a midget with a cable hanging from his belly button comes popping out of my wife's vagina and immediately starts to cry. I try to calm him down, to convince him that there's nothing to worry about, that by the time he grows up, everything here in the Middle East will be settled. Peace will come. There won't be any more terrorist attacks. And even if once in a blue moon there is one, there will always be someone original, someone with a little vision around to describe it perfectly. He quiets down and then considers his next move. He's supposed to be naive, seeing us as how he's a newborn, but even he doesn't buy it. And after a second's hesitation and a small hiccup, he goes back to crying.
So Lev's birth has really given you something to think about, something to write about, that's slightly different maybe from your other stories. In here, I mean, this is non-fiction, which we'll talk about, which is I think apart from your newspaper articles and essays, you haven't published a book of non-fiction before. But, you know, you've got a part of that memoir, which is your image of baby Lev as a man who weighs 4.5 kilogram, the first enlightened person you'd ever met, but also a psychopath and a junkie. Why did he strike you like that?
No, I think that, you know, when you become a father, like nothing prepares you to becoming a father. You know, there aren't any being a father studies. You know, you don't need a license to have a baby, and when everything that happens kind of comes out of the blue. And it's amazing how with a newborn baby that there are those moments where you feel how it's completely in the present, you know, and there are those moments where you do anything to get a bit of milk, you know, and he moves between all those extremes, you know. He has no morals, he doesn't see the other, but at the same time he's really, you know, naive and has no malice in him. So it's like they say in Melbourne, 5 seasons in a day. So when you spend a day with your baby, you know, you see him going through all those motions, you know, and for me, I never had a great desire to write nonfiction, but I think that becoming a father, there were so many things that I just needed to write, just so I would be able to kind of reflect on them and to be able to understand my feelings towards them.
So it was about being a father, but also about being a son. And I mean, you've obviously been a son all your life, up until the time you were a father and a son.
I'm very good at being a son, you know. It was slightly easier.
And I remember when we first met, we discovered that our parents were all Holocaust survivors from Poland, and both of our dads lived in a hole in the ground for 2 years. And both of our mothers were child survivors in Warsaw, in hiding. But your parents were happy survivors, which was unusual. Tell me about them.
Yeah, I never understood that because I knew quite a few Holocaust survivors, even as a kid, and most of them were very depressed and pessimistic, and my parents were incurable optimists. And my late father's explanation was that he said that when he was a kid, like everything was horrible, he was prosecuted, they wanted to kill him all the time. And he said, and since then things just get better, So he
started from a low base.
Yeah, he believed that, that the low expectations that he had being raised through the war made him kind of always be surprised for the better by the nature of humankind.
But he discovered he was very good at something during the war. He sounds like such an optimist, like such someone who can kind of look at a situation and find the grain of a good story. What did he discover in that hole?
So my father stayed with his parents for 620 days in a hole in the ground, and when they dug that hole, they thought that they only stayed there for a day because it was in a farm. The farmer, who wasn't Jewish, agreed to hide them, and they knew that the Germans were going from farm to farm looking for Jews, but they thought that, that the moment they see there are no Jews there, they're going to leave. But the Germans decided to build their headquarters in this farmer's farm, and they were unable to leave because the German headquarters was 20 meters from where they were hiding. So I asked my father how he kept his sanity, all this time, and my father said that he believes that every human being is the world champion at something, and that the tragedy that we have to live through that most of the people in the world never discover the real talent. You could be potentially the world's tennis champion and play basketball all your life, or you could be very talented in playing the violin but never learn how to play an instrument. And he said that the thing that he got from the war, that he discovered his real talent, and his real talent was his ability to sleep at will. And the way that he would describe it, he said that, they would be in the hall, he would fall asleep, and when he would wake up, he would ask his dad, is the war over? And when his father said, no, it's not over yet, son. So he said, okay, and would go to sleep some more. I'm sure it wasn't that way, but that's at least the way that he would like to tell it.
So he was a big storyteller for you when you were a young child, wasn't he?
Yes, the truth is that my mother was kind of the writer between them. And my mother had these things that because one of her strongest and best memory from her parents were the bedtime stories that her parents would tell her, and because those stories were told to her in the ghetto, so they had no access to book, and they made them up. She kind of believed that that a good parent has to make up the bedtime stories for the kid. That that kind of buying a children's book is the easy way out. It's like ordering a pizza, It's what the lazy parent does. But a good parent kind of cuts a fresh story every night for its child. And she had this tradition of storytelling in our home, and we had tons of books, but we didn't have any children's books. These were just for the lazy neighbors, And the problem was that sometimes my mom worked late, and when she would work late, my father would have to tell us bedtime stories. And my father was a good storyteller, but he didn't have my mother's talent to invent things, so he would just tell us stuff, like he would tell me things that had happened. And all his stories had this kind of Hasidic qualities, that they would talk about situations in which people did things that were not right, but he was still able to kind of empathize with them and see some kind of a goodness in their action. And one thing that all these stories had in common is that they always took place in a whorehouse, and the protagonists were always prostitutes and mafia guys and drunk people. And as a 5-year-old, when I would ask my father, Father, what's a prostitute? He would say, a prostitute is somebody that gets paid to listen to other people's problems. And when I would ask him, what's a mafia guy? He said, oh, these are people who collect rents even from buildings that they don't own. And the drunk people are those people who have these medical conditions that the more liquids they drink, the happier they become, And very early on, I kind of entered this dilemma. If when I grew up, I should become a drunk male prostitute or a drunk mafia guy. But at an older age, when I realized that, what all those things really were, then I kind of confronted my father about it. And what he said was that as a bedtime story, he would want to tell something from his life and his childhood, but all his childhood stories were really, really sad, and he didn't want to tell them. So, as he would say, he said, I fast-forwarded in my life until I reached kind of a good time, And that good time was after the war, in which when he joined the Irgun, which was an underground that fought the British, and his job was to buy weapons from the Italian mafia so they can be smuggled to Israel, to then Palestine. And all this period, because he couldn't afford rent, then the mafia who had owned a whorehouse, they let him stay in one of the rooms there without paying. And he said, well, this was the first good time in my life because I didn't have to hide the fact that I was a Jew, and because basically I felt like an equal human being. So whenever I would want to tell a story, I would kind of run my biography in my mind, and when I reached that whorehouse, I said, oh, that I could tell,
So you've got a good story about him, because he was still consorting with prostitutes even in his later life too, wasn't he? Because he had an office that he rented to some ladies of the night. And tell us about what happened when he was 80 on his birthday.
Yeah. Well, this is a story that actually I've learned from his business partner at the Shiva, So apparently what happened was that they had an office, and my father in the last 10 years of his life went into real estate, and he had all the energies, but he didn't have the money, so he basically owned this 15% of this office that they would rent. And they rented it to a lawyer that he didn't really like, because the lawyer was rude and lied all the time. And the partner said that one day my father said that he found really nice tenants, and when he brought the tenants in and they talked to the partners, they said that they want to do a massage place there. And the partner had listened, and when they left, he said to my father, they're prostitutes. And my father said, yeah, but they're nice prostitutes, and this guy's an asshole lawyer, So he talked his partner to renting it to those prostitutes, and they had very good relationship. And one day, when the partner and him, they came to collect the money, and the partner said that it was my father's 80th birthday, and the woman who ran it said to my father, I've retired 10 years ago. I'm just manager here, but I like you so much, and it's your birthday, I want to do something nice for you. And my father said, Svetlana, I'm 80 years old. You want to do something nice for me? Make me a cup of tea with a piece of lemon inside, so.
So you've got a soft spot in your heart for prostitutes, but it seems to me that you really don't like taxi drivers. Because there's something about your stories, even they're fiction or non-fiction, there's often a taxi driver, an angry taxi driver, a taxi driver you have an argument with. What's going on with the taxi drivers?
Well, I use taxis a lot, and it's not that I don't like taxi drivers, but I seem to have this, I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but I get into very, very intimate relationship with them, over the 10 minutes we drive from one place to another.
How does that happen?
I don't know.
Do you sit in the front or the back?
I usually sit in the front. I usually sit in
Number
the lap,
one.
and they say, "Sir, would you mind moving to the other chair?" It's very difficult to drive,
Because I know you're not very tall, but you're not that short.
Yeah, no, it's just I guess I think that somehow it's probably me, but they always tell me things, and maybe I always ask them questions. But so many times it goes very, very well, and sometimes it doesn't. It's like when you get intimate. Sometimes things don't go that well. Yeah.
You have a story about a taxi driver and your son in this book.
Yeah, I think that there is this thing about kind of being a parent that when you live your life, you kind of the narrator of your story, And for me, it's always kind of like this kind of Lionheart kind of story about brave me going outside of the street in Tel Aviv, fighting for justice and the Jewish way, and when you have a child and he starts asking you questions, you realize that there are other ways to look at things. And when Lev was, I think, 3.5 or 4, we drove to my parents' place, and he kind of moved his feet from side to side, and he knocked out the ashtray of the taxi, and the driver started shouting at my son, and I started shouting at the taxi driver. And and the taxi driver was very aggressive, but I guess I was even more aggressive. And at some stage, my son asked me to explain to him, what happened. Like, what did the expression used was, what did the man say? And the man says, like, what the fuck are you doing? And I said, well, he was saying that you should mind the way that you move your feet, And he said, and what did you say to the man? I said, well, I said to him that he's correct, but he should say that in a polite way, not shout. And then he said, but you shouted at him, So he said, yes, and now I'm going to apologize, And it was like me trying to kind of be very kind of like, a children TV, educational children TV to my son, while there was like this taxi driver who wanted to kill me, and I was really, really furious. And I think that there was something in the way that my son had exposed all these mechanisms that in the end kind of brought peace to our taxi, Maybe we should have like 4 years old running the region, maybe, because in the end, I think he made both the taxi driver and me feel a little ashamed for being so aggressive. Well, I'm sure that if he wouldn't have been there, I would feel very righteous and, proud of myself.
You've got a story in this, The 7 Good Years, about, oh no, maybe it's in the other one. I can't now remember whether it's fiction or non-fiction. About having everything in the pockets, it's a non-fiction, it's a fiction story.
I can tell you the non-fiction story behind it.
All right, do that. Well, I'll tell them what it is, though, because it's just a very short, it's an Etgar Keret short story, which is what we want from you, and about somebody who has pockets bulging. And there's always things in the pockets. There's an extra a mint or something, or there's a Band-Aid, or there's all kinds of stuff.
Stamps. Cigarettes.
Everything for
Children
just in
toys,
case.
yeah.
Just in case somebody should come and ask for something, and then you have it, and it's a marvelous thing. And I do the same thing. I see this big bag here. It's full of stuff like that. And I wondered where that idea came from. Does it come from having parents who survived in Poland just for the sake of one little thing? If only you had this kopeck, or if only you had this Band-Aid, it would have saved everything. Is that where that comes from, or not? You tell me where it comes from.
My explanation is that I don't own a car, and that I always lose bags, so I have to have everything on me, That if I would have a car, then I would have all this stuff in my car. But maybe the second generation explanation is more accurate. But the story with this story is really, it's kind of a love story, because in the story the guy has all this stuff in his pocket in case he'll meet a girl, and she'll ask him for something, and he would want to have that thing. He wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to meet the love of his life, because he doesn't have those things in his pocket. But the truth is that during one of the suicide bombing waves, I went to a shopping mall, and they have those metal detectors in them. And as I went through the metal detector, it buzzed, and they asked me to take all the stuff out of my pockets. And what happened is that when you do that, the other people who want to get inside the shopping malls, they have to wait. So I started taking out stuff out of my pockets, but I have many pockets, and I have many things in each of those pockets. So they were kind of beginning to queue, like I had more and more audience, like saying, "Oh, and that's a ping pong ball, yeah, and that's you can blow bubbles with this one," and like all those people who really wanted to get to the shopping mall were kind of losing their patience, and I had this kind of big audience that shifted, like in the beginning they were amazed, and after that they were angry, and at some stage they felt sorry for me, and I just wanted to be over, but also I had this urge to kind of give them a speech and to say to them, "Look, I'm not just a weirdo. It's kind of part of the way that I see life, and it comes from a very positive place." But I was afraid that they'll lynch me, so I didn't say anything. I just kind of put everything into my pocket and kind of. But when I got home, I wrote this story, just to explain why I have a lot of stuff in my pockets.
And one of the explanations is for just in case a most wonderful woman comes up and asks you for where she could find a stamp or something, or ask the protagonist. But talking about a wonderful woman...
and if she'll cough, I'll have a mint.
You have a mint, and if she's bleeding, you can give her a Band-Aid.
Of course.
It's very rare to find a man like that. Your description in the 7 Good Years of meeting your wife, Shira, it's a very funny story about what happened very late in a club. It was in a club,
yeah. And Shira is here, so...
I can see her. She's right here. We can check with her whether she agrees with this.
So we were, like, I knew Shira, but I didn't know her very well, and the club had very loud music, and when I reached it, after a few minutes, I said, I can't stay here, it's too loud. And as I was about to leave, Shira entered the club, and she said to me, are you staying here? And I said, no, I'm just leaving. And she looked at me and she said, "Kiss me." I said, wow, beautiful girl that I hardly know says to me, "Kiss me," but I was still too embarrassed. And I said to her, "How about we go somewhere and have a coffee? The music here is really loud." And she said, "Okay." And we went and, and had coffee, and we talked, and I walked her home, and I called her the next day, and we started dating. And when we were together, I said to her, I always kind of looked at you from a distance, and you never looked to me like this kind of girl that is so courageous and that would say to somebody, "Kiss me." And she said, no, I said, "You'll never find a taxi." But I think that, that this is kind of a very writer kind of thing, right? I think that, what writers usually do, we kind of upgrade reality, So it also works on the personal basis, It's kind of the fact that I don't hear exactly what people say, and I hear better things than what they say. Yeah. Makes my life better,
Is that annoying for Shira now that, you hear things differently from what she's saying?
We can ask her. Is it?
No, it's not annoying at all. Except she comes across in these stories, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, Shira, it's pretty tough with you, because she's sometimes critical of your approach to the world, Is she like that?
Well, we have we've had our run-ins. So if speaking of taxi drivers, that when I lived on my own, I have this superpower that it works only on males. But when I look at somebody, I know when they need to pee.
Pee, yeah.
Yeah, and since I travel a lot with taxis, so it happened a few times that I saw that the driver needs to pee, and I said, "Do you want to use the restrooms in my place?" And when me and Shira, we moved together, there was this incident that she was taking an afternoon nap, and as she went out of the room, still waking up, she saw this guy unzipping himself. And, "What is he doing in our place?" And we started having an argument if it's a standard thing that people invite taxi drivers to pee in their houses and in their homes, and Shira claimed that people don't do that, and I claimed And I claim that because she's evil and heartless, then she built this kind of dissonance in her mind that she can't deal with the fact that she's not generous, So she made up that the world is like her, But I said to her, taxi drivers, all the days are on the road. What do you want them to pee in their trunks? People, they rely on people offering them to use the restroom. So we had this disagreement, and in the end, I realized that she's an evil woman, but that she has other good sides. So I agreed not to invite any more taxi drivers to our place.
But you work together, though. You sometimes write things together.
Yeah, we collaborate on many things. We wrote a children's book together. We directed a feature film together. We worked with a dance group called Pilobulus on a dance together. We really like working together.
And how do you live together and work together? How is it? Is there any kind of rules to do that?
We don't have any rules about anything. I think it's a problem, but but I always like to say that collaborating on a project, as a couple, is much easier than just living your life together. When you make a movie together, it's much easier than just living together, because I think that the problem is that when you live together, you have this kind of fundamental argument. Let's say, if our life is a story, what kind of story is it? What is our goal? Are we trying, to create beautiful things, or to make enough money to move to a bigger apartment, or I just don't know. We can argue what the plot is, but the moment that, let's say, you collaborate on a film, then we both know what we want. We want this film to be as good as it can be. So it actually kind of simplifies life. It's like it puts you in the same frame. And I also think that we're very different in the way in which we work as artists. Shira is a poet in her nature, and I'm kind of more of a writer or a prose writer, in that sense that, maybe being a son of Holocaust survivors, I always think about the future and the past. And Shira is always in the present, which makes me many times very jealous, because while she enjoys things, I think what's going to happen next, But when you work on a film, I think that it's really helpful to have those two perspectives, or when you work on any kind of stories, because it's like I'm the kind of guy say, let's take an umbrella, it's going to rain, and she said, no. But in the end, it's going to rain, But she's the kind of person that while we're outside, she will notice all those kind of things that I didn't even notice, because I was trying to figure out where the bus stop will be, So I think we complement each other as artistic collaborators.
So why non-fiction now?
It started the day my son was born. I really felt that there was something about this experience. I think that for me, writing was always a way kind of sorting out my emotions, So it was because I was always this kind of kid that, that would talk to somebody, and somebody would say and a friend would say to me, why are you crying? And I say, I'm not crying, So I was never kind of aware what I'm feeling and where I'm at. And I think that writing fiction was always kind of a way of taking some raw emotions and creating a plot around them and making them into something that kind of made sense. And I think that when I became a parent, then there was something, again, with this reflexiveness of a little guy looking at you and you looking at yourself through this little guy's eyes, that I needed to write about it, but suddenly, I don't know, fiction didn't seem to work, and non-fiction seemed to work better. And I think that when I started writing it, I was kind of afraid of it. I still look down to non-fiction, I must admit. There is something about fiction. It's like when somebody creates this beautiful fiction film, you say, wow, what a word he had in his mind. When somebody does a brilliant documentary, you say, God should get the credit, He just shot it, And when I tell my life stories, I always say, I didn't invent anything, even though my wife would claim that I invented some of the things in the book. But it doesn't seem to me as kind of impressive as making up a character. So if my father was amazing and I write about my father's amazing life, then so what, And it took me a long time to kind of put myself in a place where I could say, you know what, like this is a different way, different creative process, but I appreciate it too, and I think it's also worth putting out in the world.
There's not as many talking fish in real life as there are in your stories.
Yes.
You know, and or people who are, I think, child killers who get killed and then come back as a teddy bear.
Winnie the Pooh, to be exact.
Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
Or people who have who die and come back as a guava.
Yeah.
A fruit. That's some imagination you've got there. But you give yourself permission to go anywhere. You don't say you're not limited by the laws of physics.
Yeah, that's the thing that that I think that there is something about kind of I remember as a child that I would always say to myself, why tell things the way they happened? You can tell them much better than the way that they had happened, But again, having said that, I think that there are many stories, about my family that sound so made up. It's like the story that I was told on my father's shiva, about these guys that maybe I can tell.
Sure.
So when on the shiva, my father had from his side of the family some people who were very religious, but my father wasn't religious, and one of them came and he tried to kind of build a case of why my father was a real chassid, even though he wasn't kind of a believer. And he told me the story of these relatives that we've had, and this relative was a very, very religious person, and he was supposed to be like kind of to become an important rabbi in Poland, but one day he decided that he leaves religion behind, and he kind of shaved his beard and said, I'm going to the train station, I'll go to Israel, I'll become a pioneer. And before he left, his rabbi, who was this really big authoritative rabbi, asked to meet him, and he looked him in the eye and he said to him, you will not die before you return to believe in God, And he said, okay, and got on the train and got to Israel. And during, I think it was the 48 war or the 67 war, I don't remember which war, they were shooting mortars on the kibbutz where he lived. And he saw this woman kind of crying, and she said, I have a baby, I have to go get back to my child. And he said to her, if you stay next to me, nothing's going to happen to you. And she said to him, why? And he said, well, because the rabbi said that I will not die before I return to believe in God, and I don't believe in God, so I can't die. And she stayed next to him, and he stayed alive, and all this life, this guy believed that he was invulnerable. They found him almost drowning in the ocean. When they found him, they saw him hitting the water and saying, I don't believe in you. I don't think you exist, And he was saved yet again. And when he was really old, he had this tumor and he got into a coma. And the doctor said that he was supposed to die in a day, but he didn't. And the relatives and the children of these men, they met my father, and they were all secular, As I met my father, and they said to my father, that the doctors think that he's in great pain, but it's been already a couple of weeks and he didn't die. And my father wore a talit and a yarmulke, and was next to his bed, praying all night. And in the morning, the man had died. And when this religious guy told me that in the Shiva, he said, for a believer, this would be trivial to go and pray next to a dying man's bed. But for somebody who's not a believer, to do that, he has to be a real chassid. And I think that, that there's something about my family that it's all full of all those oxymorons, and that those oxymorons can just exist, just because of this kind of bursts of humanity that makes everything possible. I actually remember that my father told me once I had this kind of school project, and they asked me what, I think I was 10, and they asked me what was the thing I was most proud of in my life, and I thought I'll ask my father, and so I could get a pointer. And I asked my father what was the thing that he was most proud of in his life, and he thought about it, and he said, well, I think the thing I'm most proud of is that since I got to Israel, I fought in 5 wars, always in the infantry, always in the front line, and I never hurt anybody, you know? So this was our kind of our family legacy, you know, kind of trying to, and again, you know, I think I would always say that I always try to do that, but the only way I know how to fight very fiercely and not hurt anybody is by writing. You know, that's my solution of keeping that legacy.
Well, we're going to ask for some questions in a moment, but we're talking as if you're an only child, but of course you're not. As I said before, you have a brother and a sister, two very different people. Well, tell us about your sister. Your sister is Orthodox and she has 11 children.
And 19 grandchildren.
19 grandchildren.
At the age of 54, yeah.
Yeah. And she hasn't read any of your stories.
No, but actually she's very proud of my writing. You know, she can't read it because they have this term, it's called bitul zman. It's kind of like a waste of time. So it would be, you cannot read like fiction and stuff like that, but she's very proud of me.
And your brother?
And my brother, he's a genius. He graduated from high school when he was 14 and a half and studied computers. And he had this kind of experience during the Lebanon wars that it changed his worldview, and he became a very, very radical left-wing activist, and he started the legalized marijuana movement. In Israel, it was they ran for parliament, and they were like a couple of thousand votes short from getting into parliament. And he's now back in Israel, but for 10 years he lived in Thailand in a tree house with high-speed internet, where he conducted all his social activism from that tree.
That's quite a family.
Yeah. Well, I think that, when you say it, it sounds kind of like, I always said that, that being the youngest, I could never surprise my parents, like that even if I would have like 8 children and live in a cave, my siblings would still outdo me. But I think that, except for this, I think that the amazing thing is that all of them are amazing, generous and good people, and I feel very lucky to be born to such a tiny family because of the Holocaust. We don't have many relatives, but to such a family that I think that any of my family members, if I would have met in the street, he or she would have immediately become my best friend.
Thank you. What does your son think about being in all your stories?
Well, my son likes the fact that, that I write stories. Actually, when he was younger, he told me once that when he grows up, he has a dilemma. He doesn't know about his career. That he either wants to become a taxi driver or an astronaut. And I asked him, why an astronaut? And he said, that, well, they say to you that you reach a place that nobody had ever been in before. It's pretty amazing. And I said, why a taxi driver? And he says, because they make lots of money. And then I realized that, for a kid, the only thing that counts is cash. And in Israel, like until 2 years ago, you couldn't pay with credit. So you would always see them going with bundles of money. And I said to him, look, I make money too. And he said, yeah, but not as much as a taxi driver. And I said to him, when you work, it's not only the money, you can get other things. And he said, what other thing? And I said, what? I don't know, if you're a judge, you get people's respect. If you're a doctor, you get people's gratitude. And he said, well, you're a writer. What do you get from people when you write? And I said, you get a lot of love from people. And he thought about it for a moment, and he said, what? I think that's probably the best thing you can get from people. So he appreciates it as a job, even though I have a feeling that his mind is set to become a corrupt politician. So I don't think he's going to go to the arts.
Now, there was a man up here.
Okay, so I was sent here by the Hebrew discussion group that I belong to, and we have been reading one of your short stories every month for the last 12 months.
Wow.
And last night we read one which I thought was absolutely extraordinary. It was about Joseph, And Joseph's this producer who's never produced anything who wants you to write a script for him. And we're carried along with this discussion. You want to get out of there, but he wants to pay you some money, so you're not sure whether you should leave or go. And in the meantime, a guy comes into the room and he's sweating. And you say, well, this guy's got a story, and suddenly we're talking about life and sex and food and what have you. And we say, well, what's this guy's story? And he's sweating, wearing a big coat. And eventually the guy blows himself up. He's a suicide bomber. And we took a vote. Half of us said, this is just meant to be allegorical. There's no meaning to all of this. And half of us said, this is a true story. Not necessarily that you were involved and you were there, but it's an amalgam of what actually happens in Israel. How are we to read your stories?
Wow, I hardly know how to write them, you know. I think that this story, it's not really in the sense that, you know, it didn't really happen. Though I think that factually, I've read a lot of people who were in suicide bombings, and the way that they always talk about a very mundane, you know, situation in which they see the suicide bomber before exploding, and many times he does something very mundane. He looks for things in his pockets, or he smiles, or he sneezes, you know, which makes sense. But the real person in this story is the producer, because I do know a producer whom I base the story on, and he actually did produce a couple of movies, but I couldn't help thinking that there was something about his choice of becoming a producer, that it's this ability to kind of live your life and meet people and use your imagination, you know, and say to people, I'm a film producer, instead of saying like, I'm just a guy who wants to live and don't want other people to call me a bum, you know. So there was something in his essence that had made me write this story. And it's funny that I think that even though there is a suicide bomber in it, I think that the suicide bomber for me was always very much in the background, you know. The story was more about this person and the strong impressions that he had on me.
But that story also has the waitress in it, who is who's a lovely person, who's very, you know, personable, and who sees this guy who's sweating, and she dances towards him to take his order.
Yeah.
And she's the only one who gets killed. The other people who are kind of miserable, you know, not really that happy, you know, wish they were somewhere else. They continue.
Yeah, well, but I think that, you know, I think that there is something about living in a place like Israel where you know, where you have those eruptions of violence and where people die. There is something very existential about it, because I think that, you know, in another story in that book collection, I say there is a guy a pathologist who operates a woman who died in a suicide bombing, and he discovers that she suffered from incurable cancer. And he says, what is cancer if not a terrorist attack from the heavens, you know? What is God doing if not trying to intimidate us, you know? And I think that, you know, that you don't have to be in Israel to go into a cafe and see a waitress who's lovely, and then next day she'll be run down by a car, or she'll have an incurable disease. There is something about this arbitrariness of life that gets to you. It doesn't matter where you live.
Another question. Okay. If you do have a question, keep your hands up so we can... Okay, there's, first of all, one in the back and then at the front. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Firstly, I wanted to ask you if you wrote your latest book in English. And secondly, how has the rest of your family reacted to it, your mother or maybe other relatives, since it feels like it's so personal?
Well, I didn't write it in English. My English isn't good enough. I wrote it in Hebrew and it was translated to English. Well, you know, it's funny, but you know, I'm not even 100% sure that, let's say, my mother had fully read it. It's like I gave it to her, and the feeling in the house was that she really liked it, But I have a feeling that, I'm sure that all my family members had read all my fiction, but I'm not that sure that they read this book, this non-fiction book. And the way that I kind of tell it to myself is probably that they know all of this already, or maybe they're afraid that if they read it, it wouldn't fit the way that they remember it. I don't know, but it was never kind of like if there's a good review about the books, then my family will be happy about it. But unlike other books where I found myself sitting with family member and discussing certain stories, there is something about this book that maybe the fact that it didn't come out in Hebrew, had a lot to do with that. Usually my family reads my books in Hebrew. But this book didn't come out in Hebrew, mainly because of my son, because it tells many intimate stories about him, and we thought about it together, my wife, me, and him, and we all decided, or rather, they all decided that it's better that it will be published when he's older, in Hebrew, just so. I don't know, imagine that somebody would write a review and say, we loved all the characters in the book, but the kid is an asshole, And this could happen,
Well, he's a psychopath and a junkie, which is actually in the book.
Yeah. And, when you write about your son that he's a psychopath and his teacher reads it, he may get lower grades for that. So I think that the fact that kind of the book didn't come out in Hebrew kind of put it in a slightly different status. I think that, everybody seems to be okay with it, but I can't really, I'm not exactly sure that all of them had read it.
Did we have, yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up on your stories. My name is Yossi, I'm from Israel. First of all, I have to say I always enjoyed the fantastic imagination you have. And even having to read your book in high school, I loved it, but you have to read this book, and I was like, okay, I read it already twice, and I noticed that with the years, reading more books, there's a bit more emphasis, you focus a bit more on, there's slight more political touches, and also reading a bit more articles that you wrote, and hearing some of your opinion. I was wondering if you think it's becoming stronger with the years, the need to pass, or it's just me, that I read it more?
No, I think you're correct. I think that, that basically if I would have to define myself, I don't see myself as a political person. I'm kind of, I always voted, and there were always things that had annoyed me, but I never saw myself as a political person. And frankly, I really enjoy writing fiction. Writing fiction really is, for me, the metaphor I use for it is like floating in space. You don't have any weight, and you're not encumbered by anything. And writing op-eds, opinion pieces for newspapers is taking out the garbage or washing dishes. It's not fun at all, and I hate doing that. I hate writing it. I hate publishing it. When you publish a story, then either people really like what you wrote, or they just stop reading it in the middle, so there's no harm is done. Nobody ever came to me in the street and said, I read your story and it's horrible and I want to punch you. But many people read my opinion pieces and said exactly that thing to me when they met me in the street. And and the idea is that I can get people annoyed easily, without going out and writing stuff, So I never wanted to write political pieces. I think the two things that happened. One of them that now I'm a father, and I think that in Israel I always lived in this kind of continuous present. Never kind of asking myself too much what's going to happen in 10 years, or 8 years. So now what's going to happen in 8 or 10 years is that my son will be in the army, And I think that this responsibility is that you won't need to fight the war, or that if you fight one, at least it will be one that I can justify. It became an issue. And the other thing is that my wife is here, so so she can vouch for that too. I'm not the best citizen in the world. I'm a lazy guy. So let's say when we go down the street and we see some piece of junk kind of blocking the pavement, she says, let's move it. Maybe a family will come with a stroller. I say to her, you know what? Let's go to the supermarket. And if by the time we're back, nobody had moved it, I promise I'll move it, And there are good other people, better people who always move it before we get back from the supermarket. And I think that with politics, I always said, there are good, smarter people writing their opinion pieces. They don't need me, We have Amos Oz, we have David Grossman, we have all those smart, large-hearted, big figures there. And the truth is that things are getting, in my opinion, more difficult in my country. And you can't let David Grossman and Amos Oz do all the work, They are getting older, and somebody should help a little. And I found myself kind of, especially during the last Gaza war, I found myself like that. My default is just to pick up a newspaper and look for this guy, write something, and say, yes, that's exactly it. And when you open the newspaper and you don't find these guys, and in the end you have to become this guy. When a kind of voice is not being heard, then you find yourself pushed to writing things down. And I'm really there. If I talk about my life, there isn't one thing in my life that I hate more than being in this situation. Really, really, like if I could do something, if I could live in a world where I won't feel that I have to write a political piece, then I would be a much happier person. I'd rather write stories than criticize my prime minister. It's really, I'm not a confrontational guy, and I'm not very good at it. And I don't think that the role of writing for me is to tell people, how to do things right, And sometimes I find some kind of a more kind of poetic way to talk about it, and then it's still a pain, a pain in the the neck. Yeah, it's still a pain in the neck, but it's like when I had the letter correspondence with Saad Kashua, and I came up with the three-state solution, like a Israeli state, a Jewish state, a Palestinian state, and a state for all those people in the region who wants to kill each other, So sometimes I say, okay, so it's a little bit, but still, I would rather leave this behind and go back to writing stories.
And please thank him for sharing his time with us tonight.
Thank you, Ramona. Thanks. Thank you so much.